It's disrespectful.
Without further ado, I invite the first speaker of the Affirmative team to start and to stand and deliver this speech. And I'll do one clap at 1 minute to indicate the opening of POIs, one clap at 7 minutes to indicate the closing of POIs, 2 claps at 8 minutes, and then 3 claps at 8 minutes and 15 seconds.
I'm not so fat to see me, but I'll run with it. It is a truth universally acknowledged that books are only meaningful insofar as their readers can connect and find meaning in them. When we restrict literature to one interpretation, regardless of its origins, we doom it to death. 3 things I'll be doing for you in my speech today. Firstly, some important setup and model on how we see this world. Secondly, and then on to my 2 substantive points. One on how we get better reader engagement, and the second one on how we're going to get more authors and more books in the market helping the arts. So first of all, some setup. What do we want in this debate? What do we want out of it? We want a greater, more vibrant, a better, literature, art, culture. How are we going to get this? We're going to get this to having more books, more people, more books and more readers more books and more readers, and we're also going to get better engagement and happier readers. More diversity means more people can connect with them. That comes from having more readers. And why do authors write? I think this is very important. We believe there's many reasons and there's many ways in why authors write. For some people, it's therapy. For some reasons, expression of their ideas. For some people, it is a message. But overall, they choose literature and they choose reading and writing books and novels because they love literature. What do they love about literature? They love the engagement. They love the interpretations that literature can have. They've connected with literature before, and they want other people to connect with literature in the same way. That's why they choose literature and not something like the movies, like film, music, or anything else. Why do readers read? Readers read for a very similar reason, because they want connection to something. They want to connect with things, they want to feel something, and they do this through meaning. And then what does this widespread action that we see look like? We see that it's being more open to different interpretations. It's like in school essays, for example, teaching our kids, you don't have to write this way to get a good mark. It is that have your own interpretation, look at a play, interpret it how you want to, but be able to justify that, be able to back that up. And we also think as literary critics, writing a piece, writing in a blog, not being shunned immediately for having a different interpretation of Shakespeare. As long as they can back that up with some thought, with some meaning behind it, they can do that. And we believe overall, the effects of that is going to be more accepting for an individual reader to be able to do this as well. And that's what we think that looks like. And then finally, this definition, what do we think the arts are like? What do we think literature is like at the moment? We think literature is dying because we're having less readers and less authors. Why is this happening? Because we've got things like TikTok, because we've got things like social media, we've got movies and medias replacing them, which people believe can get the same amount of engagement across, the same amount of connection with, the same amount of connection in an easier and a faster and more engaging way. We want to get into a world where we can reverse that process by getting more engagement from reading. So how do we get better engagement from our reading? And this is the first substantive point I'm moving on to now. Context for this is again readers read for connection and they're happy when that happens. And when I read, I'm going to prove in this point that by getting better engagement, getting better connection, we're going to get happier readers, more engaged readers, and that's going to be better for the arts as a whole, be able to reverse the cycle that I've just explained to you. So how do we prove this? Firstly, we prove that readers are now able to bring their own perspectives. When we no longer have one exclusive interpretation, which is the author's intention in this case, and people don't feel pressure to follow that interpretation to think about a piece in that way. It's socially acceptable to have your own interpretation of media. It means that when you're reading something, you allow yourself to think differently to the general. What does it mean? It brings your own ideas, you bring your own perspectives, you bring your own culture, you bring experience, you bring context, you bring your own ideas to a piece of artwork. And this is going to give you a different meaning, but it's going to be one that you like, one that you relate with, one that you connect with. Again, as I told you, that is how we readers and how they judge their engagement with media, through connection. And what do we believe the outcomes of this is going to be? It means you like the the book more because you've connected with it, so you're a happier reader. It means you're going to read more books, you're going to like read more from this author, for example. That means like an author can now get more things, but also like you're talking more about this book, you're getting discussion, and I'll talk to you more about how like we also get other things from this. Second way we prove this is that like in a scenario in which you disagree with the author and you disagree with what the reader is with what the author is trying to get to you. So a reader can often disagree. In this scenario, when we have one interpretation, you feel like you can't connect with the book because you're not allowed to have a different interpretation of what the author is trying to get across to you. If you disagree with that interpretation, you don't connect with the book, you don't like the book. You feel like you just wasted 300 pages or something, hours of your life, trying to connect with something that you like at the end of the day, you don't connect with. If you have multiple interpretations, we believe you can bring your own interpretation, you can find an interpretation, even if it's not the author's interpretation, you can connect with that and you can get happier because of that. You find that you're not wasting time, you feel like you don't want to like next time, you can actually go read another book because you can get that connection again. You're not actually just going to like turn to social media, for example, next time you do it. Again, you're going to get happier and you're going to get the same outcomes I just described to you. Thirdly, across the time period, we think that like things that like guys wrote ages ago are always going to have a different meaning to like what we like perceive as important today, right? We see like old stuff is far less relatable because of this. Take Much Ado About Nothing, for example. In that piece of literature, we see like gender hierarchy, like the social space, like the social ideas of like where women need to fit in society are very important into that play, into what Shakespeare's intention of it. If we allow a different meaning, a modern interpretation of what it was meaning, it means that like now a young girl can look at that and look at like Beatrice and can look at her and like that's a girl boss there, like you're changing relationships, better relationships, you can get better relationships because of that. That means a reader, a young girl's not going to connect with that play far more. They're going to be far more incentivized to read more of Shakespeare and to do more of this when they saw like just the author's intention, just what Shakespeare wrote. Fourth, final way we prove this, we get more discussion, we get more people talking about it when you like a book, and we just believe like you're going to get your friends engaged and your friends talking about it more because you don't want to miss out on what you're doing. And why is this important? Again, if the art is dying, as I've explained to you, then we're going to make it far more worthwhile. There's no, like, we believe it's far more worthwhile that you read this and you don't go to some other form of media to like get those quick fixes that you get. It's far more, and that's how we get like far more sustainable, for example. I'll take a POI now.
The study of literature is inherently difficult. When we give an author's interpretation, we have a starting point for people to build off their own ideas.
Well, fundamentally, I think we kind of disagree with that because we feel like anyone can look at a piece of literature and interpret a piece of literature. That's why we have like English class, for example, to teach us those skills, to teach us how to learn about those different things. And in fact, we're learning people to like get those interpretations at a younger age. In English class, for example, we can actually do this. So on to the second point about how we're going to get like more authors or more books on the market. We believe that fundamentally, context to this point, is that authors like it when you engage in some piece of way and when they have some impact on you, right? It's not like necessarily having the same meaning, but getting some connection with you, and because you want to have like that same impact as like Shakespeare, for example, or those great authors in the past, right? You prove that, we're proving this point that we're going to like get more authors and get more books, and so we're going to prove this first of all because we believe that authors are now more incentivized because you have more longevity in your books and your writings and your art creation. Authors, they like to have that impact, and things that if you have one single thing. If you've got one interpretation, eventually it's going to fall out of fashion, as I kind of explained to you before. And ultimately, you don't want that to fall out of fashion. So you want to have different interpretations that can change with your book so you have an impact over a long period of time. Things like the Canterbury Tales, which is about like a pilgrimage, something really obscure kind of, that's fallen out of fashion now compared to something like Shakespeare, something like Much Ado About Nothing. You want to have that impact on Much Ado About Nothing where we have multiple different interpretations of that. So that's something that an author now has an incentive to write more because they have a greater impact because of that. Quickly, we also believe you're happy when you're getting more connections because of this, and when you're just having that impact as I kind of explained to you. And then also we believe finally having more readers in general is going to mean more authors, is more profitable, is more sustainable to do this. Ultimately, when we have more authors, it means we're more vibrant, we're more diverse in our literary culture. It means it's more engaging, and we get this circular cycle where we ultimately get a better, more vibrant art society with better readers and better authors because of that. And that is why I'm proud to affirm.
I thank the first affirmative speaker for the speech, and I invite the first English speaker to stand with this speech.
Yes, literature is very important in society for people's enjoyment of reading, but it also serves other very crucial functions in society, like informing people how the world looks, letting people experience the lives of minorities who have been oppressed in the past, and it's all of these that make the author's intent incredibly important in the study of literature. I'm going to do 3 things in the speech then. First, some setup. Second, why death of the author is uniquely harmful to art from marginalized groups. Lastly, why we get better literary criticisms overall. 3 points on setup then. First, what is the role of literature in society? Note here, we broadly agree that there are many reasons why authors write and why people read, things like enjoyment. But crucially, it informs how people view the world. It makes people form understandings about how other groups of people live their lives, and they're able to internalize that to a degree when they haven't lived that life of their own. It's this crucial part that makes understanding the author's life important. Secondly, what does death of the author actually look like in practice? It looks like critical pieces that ignore authorial intent, or it looks like adaptations that doesn't include the author when they're in the consultation process. It looks like curriculums that don't care about what the author cared about or the life that they lived when it came to writing these texts. Alternatively, what is the counterfactual? We think it just looks like growing trends, having more forewords in your text, for instance, or having curriculums that study the author's lives and the kind of process that they went through when writing their works, like the kind of research they went and who they interviewed when creating certain pieces of stories. That can be really important. Now, before I move on to explain why it's uniquely harmful for marginalized art, I'll take a point.
How do you convey your design messages if no one's actually reading your piece of your book?
Okay, I think it's ridiculous that nobody reads these texts at all. I think people read these texts for a variety of reasons. Firstly, I think they're just enjoyable, separate from this entire field of literary analysis. People just like the plot of certain stories and they're able to engage with it in that way. I'll explain later why we actually make it more enjoyable. The crux of that is just literature is hard. It's very difficult to engage in it. It's a very difficult subject at school. It means people struggle in this field. Why does this uniquely harmful for marginalized art then? The context here is that particularly for marginalized groups, authors create their work as an extension of themselves and their experiences. This looks like wanting to share their oppression and difficulties with the rest of the world. It looks like Lynn Nottage, who wrote Sweat, when they wanted to share the experiences of black women during the deindustrialization period in America. It's these unique parts of their history which they want to share with the rest of the world. The key thing here, though, is that they create their works with the intention of voicing the concerns of their people. Why does death of the author lead to misinterpretations then and ruin this kind of process? Firstly, the experiences are non-applicable to a majority of people. So if they want to tie these texts to their own experiences, they have to shift the meaning of these texts subtly or overgeneralize their text in order to apply it to their lives. This flips their material about them enjoying these texts to a greater extent because they can twist it into their lives, because it inherently changes the meaning. But note here, even small changes in meaning can ruin the effect of text for a majority of people. For instance, if a story is about the specific racial discrimination faced by a high schooler, a white student will never experience that to the same extent, and if they're trying to apply that to their own life, it might become generalized to just talk about violence or bullying. But no, this is uniquely separate from the kind of historical oppression that the author is trying to convey, and that becomes very harmful. Secondly, the majority of people just read text with a uniquely different frame of mind than the kinds of than the minority authors who create them. That means if you never experience life as a minority, you can never even begin to read the text in the same way, which is why you need authorial intent to explain things to you, explain how they live their lives and how this changes the meaning of their text in a subtle way to actually convey the meaning of the text in a meaningful light. Thirdly, it ignores the context and beliefs of people's lives, which is quite harmful, especially after they die, right? Again, this kind of flips their material about applications to old texts, because they can often be co-opted in harmful ways, right? For instance, right-wing people in America like to take text and try to shift their material to make it seem like it benefits the right-wing agenda. For instance, there's an article that shifts Walt Whitman's Pioneers to say that America is inherently expansionist and thrives off killing indigenous people. Alternatively, this text and Walt Whitman more generally is actually quite a liberal person in his time. He is very interested in protecting the voices and voicing the voices of minority individuals as people who are disenfranchised. When you ignore the context and the intent of the author, you can skew these texts in very harmful ways. Two outcomes then. Firstly, the ability of minority discourse gets substantially decreased. The key thing here is that you're never able to experience and voice the concerns of minorities when the voices or the kinds of people who are now propagating these texts are ones which are happy to skew the meaning. And this is particularly harmful for a couple of reasons. I think firstly, the establishment and the people who predominantly voice things like literary analysis are generally quite privileged and of a very few social sphere of people. They often come from very small groups of demographics, which means they're often going to skew it in very harmful ways. But I think secondly, it just means that the voices of these people are not being heard. But secondly, there is a subjective harm to the authors when their work gets misinterpreted, because art in this context is an extension of themselves. It's used to project their own feelings to the public and reflect who they are as a person. This response to their material, about authors liking their material being interpreted in different ways, I think authors write when they want to be seen as the world. If they think that the world is just going to skew what they're going to say in a way they never intended, they won't want to write in the first place. A lot of authors are separated from the literary academia of context. They just want to write about their lives or write about their friends' lives that make in very meaningful ways. What is the weighing of this point then? Firstly, even if you believe that readers enjoy literature a little bit less, it's less important because they're still going to be reading this and internalizing the kind of content that happens because there's other ways in which they're able to enjoy it. But secondly, there's just a very large harm for the groups of peoples involved, right? When literature is the primary way in which they're able to express their views because they're otherwise disenfranchised from the media as such. This is the most important way, and it's very crucial that their views are being represented in a unbiased way. Secondly then, why do we get better literary criticisms? The context here is that literary works are heavily influenced by who the author is. They draw their own experiences, but also their own beliefs and ideologies, right? Why do we get better literary critiques then? Firstly, it becomes far more obvious where the text is influenced by external factors, right? If you have an author who's just downright anti-Semitic, you're able to critique that in the text, and it becomes very obvious to you where the text is intertwined with the author's terrible past, and that's very good for critiquing the content of the text. Secondly then, you know the context of the stories, right? It becomes far easier for you as a reader to internalize these things when you know what's going on and why the author cared about certain issues, and it makes it far easier to internalize the themes present in the text. Lastly, I think interpretations can still happen. The key thing here is that death of the author necessarily implies you just completely ignore what the author cared about. Alternatively, you can still have interpretations on our world, it just happens in the context of the author's history. For instance, you can just disagree with the author's message, right? It was unclear why that was a specific harm that existed on our side. You just know that the author said this. You can still have your own interpretation and say, no, I just think this is wrong. But that's a legitimate criticism. What you get on their world instead, right, is you just don't know what the author's intention was. You just have no idea what there is to critique in the first place. So it becomes far more disproportionate and unbalanced on their side. What are the outcomes here? I think first, we get deeper understandings of the text. And this links to the material about text becoming more enjoyable. Because if you know what a text is supposed to be about, it becomes a far easier read for the average person. Most people are not literary scholars. It's very difficult to analyze a text and ascribe it to your own life. Alternatively, when that's just given to you, you're able to have a starting point to branch off. Texts become far easier, but they also become far more representative opposed.
I thank the first debating speaker for his speech, and I invite the second debating speaker to stand and deliver his speech.
Who needs notes? Oh, it fell off the table. Okay, sorry guys.
The only thing the negating team will be the author of is the destruction of literature. Alright, let's get into the three main points here in today's debate. First of all, this idea about bad interpretations. Second of all, this idea about critics, and note that this first one includes the marginalized group material that they gave us. And thirdly, a point about how we interpret older literature through this new framework. Alright, first of all, onto this idea of misinterpretation. They would like you to believe that people will manipulate texts without the author's intent being clear. First of all, we see that in a vast majority of texts where the author intends to send a message, note that a lot of texts, they simply want to express themselves or write about an experience or make people feel good or sell books, but occasionally they want to sell a message. The majority of the time they want to sell a message, this message is very clear. Why? Because authors understand that they really want to get it across, and they know that it's more powerful when a reader comes to the message themselves, as we've told you, because they understand it better. This means that authors try to make books that readers will understand the message of. This looks like books like The Hunger Games with very clear, overt messaging, because the author has a very clear, overt purpose in writing the book, and they know that the best way to get that across is by making it available to the average person. So then, in these fringe cases, when they tell us that, okay, there are maybe some obscure books that are really about experiences that some people won't understand. Two things here. One, if you're writing a book about a specific experience that you know a lot of people aren't going to relate to, either you are going to work it through in a way that they can relate to it by making it obvious what your messaging is in the text, by trying to insert characters that understand the point of view of someone who doesn't understand what's going on in the book, and have their characters explain it by many other literary techniques. Authors try to make sure that people understand what's going on if they're writing a book where they want those people to understand what's going on. But there are some authors who are writing a book for specific people. There are some authors who are writing a book about the challenges of being back that don't care if the white, person in the white teenager gets it. They don't care, because they're writing a book about a specific struggle that they hope might help those specific individuals who are struggling, that they hope might speak to those specific people. That's why they've written it that way, and that's who we care about, and they do not lose anything if they lose this author's interpretation. They also told us that people can manipulate text. There's a bit of a moot point for several reasons. One, the text is the author's words, so the author's own words can also be manipulated. Obviously, you are not manipulating texts that are, for example, overtly against your side. The far right is not trying to use texts about marginalized communities. They're trying to use the more ambiguous ones, and there the interpretations are more ambiguous about wider issues, and so what the author says the book is about can still be skewed because it's the author's words, just like the book is the author's words. There's no reason that this would be any different. Right. Now, I'm also going to talk about this more later, and I'll flag that, when I'm talking about how we interpret older texts, because that's a lot of what gets misconstrued, and that is largely due to the fact that there is one writer's interpretation that people try to create. Finally, we also see that for misinterpretation, at the end of this misinterpretation part, I'm going to take a one.
Because authors have specific intents, they can often get lost in the language that they use. Often authors clear this up by explaining their intents. How is this not something, well, how is this something you can still get on your side?
Okay, so we've told you that authors want to write books that speak to people if they're trying to get a message across, because when someone understands the meaning themselves, it is uniquely powerful. Why then would an author obscure their meaning behind lines and lines of complex language if that's how they wanted to get across? The most effective way for an author to get across a message is through making the reader understand it. Authors know this, and they write books the reader can understand. You don't need a 200-page essay on what a book means to understand it, otherwise it is a bad book. Alright, so moving on now to my second point. They told you a lot about marginalized books and how they were going to be misinterpreted. No, this is largely contingent on, do they want these books to be interpreted by the majority of people? If they do, okay, so they will be usually, because the author will write them that way, and we have some level of trust that authors can write books. But also the fact is that if they just want it to be understood by that community, then it will be understood by that community. I think this whole idea that authors require a massive amount of extra context to make someone understand the book overlooks the actual fact that an author writes a book to get a message across, not an explanation of a book to get a message across, not an interview after the book to get a message across, a book. Alright, now finally on to this idea of critiques. They tell you that work can be better critiqued when you understand the context of the work. Note that we don't actually think this critique is the most important thing in the debate. We actually think getting a lot of literary discussion going and getting a lot of people engaged better in books is more important. But okay, let's play on the critique ground. Fundamentally, critiquing is harder when there is one objective truth that says, okay, I'm the expert on this author, or I am this author, and I'm saying this. This is what the critique is. Not only does this disencourage discussion, I don't care that they tell you you can disagree with the author. It is harder to disagree with the author because they wrote the text, because they have authority, they have a certain level of legitimacy, and also because simply you are going against the common tide of opinion, which only exists if you have this author's interpretation. So they are getting less discussion about the book and less individual interpretations. Note that this is what we care about. When people look at a book and they form their own conclusion, and they're not intimidated by the fact that someone says, no, that's not what this book is about, and they're not intimidated by the fact that there are other interpretations out there. This is when we get more discussion about interpretations. There's more space for different interpretations because the authors aren't limiting that space. When we get more space for different interpretations, we get a lot of good things. First of all, we get better critiques, which they seem to care about. Second of all, we get a lot more people discussing literature and getting engaged in literature. That means more people are reading. That means more people are getting involved in the issue because they see these people having this debate and they decide, okay, that's important. That's a massive benefit, right? Also, we get the fact that with more talk about this book, we are coming up with more unique interpretations. Maybe an author writes a book that isn't necessarily about what you're interpreting it as. But when you interpret it as that, it helps you as a person understand something in your life better. It helps you feel better. It helps you feel seen. That is a massive benefit. Or when you interpret that, you can tell that to others. They feel seen. They don't feel like that's objectively wrong because they're buying this, the author is always right crap, right? So they can see that, and that can help them as well. That is a massive amount of people that don't get helped, because in the end, an author is one person. And when they write a successful book, they will only bring one series of personal events to the table. They will only bring one understanding to the table, and that is not what you can get from a book. You can get so many different understandings that help so many different people understand things about themselves, feel not alone, simply enjoy literature, and that is why we are not stifling them when we restrict ourselves to one interpretation, but are instead saying, actually, we just want you to read the book. This is what the author wrote. They sent this out to the world. They bore it out so that we could talk about it. We need to stop listening to individuals and start taking up the torch, start finding our own meaning and making our own interpretation of the literature important, because that is where we find people really engaging. That is where we find people really caring. That is when we find people talking, discussing, having more and more discourse about the book, and that is where we win this debate.
I thank the second speaker of the Affirmative team, and I invite the second again to stand and deliver their speech. I'm sorry, I've just been told by one of the conveners that they can't see your faces on the screen. So do you mind if I try and find a way to
maybe turn it around.
Yeah. Here we go. I have to change the.
We're just gonna rotate it.
Okay. Yeah. Makes sense.
So if you just, it's okay. Okay. Yeah, you want to turn this one? Yep.
And then put it at the far end?
Yep. You got it. Sorry.
No, I'm sorry about that as well. Here we go.
If I'm reading a book, the intent of the book is not the only thing that I focus on. nor is it the only thing that I am able to derive my enjoyment from. A book is probably like 500 pages long. During this time, a lot happens. A lot of stuff happens that I am able to relate to, that I find engaging, that I find interesting. It's unclear why this perception thing is the entire thing that is the tipping point for me no longer wanting to read books, for books no longer being in the market. 3 things in my speech then. First, I'll be doing some framing. Second, on some responsive material. And then finally, on some substantive extension. First then, on framing. I think this debate is about the perception of intent. It's if we go with the author's intent and we agree with it, we analyze how they wanted us to do it, or if you go with what the people, individuals, readers believe. I think what this means is that there are 2 types of books. One, there are books where there are clear ideas. What this looks like is the intent is probably very clear. This probably looks like a really simple child book, like Harry Potter, where the intent is clear, they show you all these nice cool narratives. But what it also means is that secondly, you have these other types of novels which probably have less clear ideas, less clear intent of author. What this looks like is you probably have memoirs, you have historical books, you have things like biographies. These are things where intent can be very implicit. Look, what this looks like is that Britney Spears' recent memoir is about her details of her life as a singer, about what she experienced, what she went through. Sure, her intent is to tell everyone about what went on, but maybe there's a deeper intent, to critique the music industry, all of this. When you don't focus on this, you essentially take it away from Britney Spears. You no longer let her push a narrative. When you have individuals focusing and taking out what they want to extract, that's when it becomes really harmful. That sets the premise for this debate. Moving on then about some responses. The first thing that they tell us is that literature is dying. I think we just need to do a censure. This isn't true. First of all, because you're a lot of people who still love to read books. You don't see the book industry dying out anytime soon. But also, second of all, they told us that there are things like social media, like TikTok. I think these are the things that actually have perpetuated our love for books. You have things like Book Talk, where thousands of millions of people have collaborated in this space to tell you about awesome books they're reading. This perpetuates the entire idea of reading. Then you have these narratives of reading being romanticized. It's really cool. Literature isn't dying, but finally people just love reading for the engagement they get out of it. Moving on then about this entire idea about engagement. They tell you that people read for connection. They're happy when it happens, when they're able to bring their own perspectives in. The first thing to note here is that engagement, like I flagged in my introduction, can come from many other aspects. For example, the intention of a book could be to talk about the meaning of life, but during this book, a person, or the main character, loses their pet. As a reader, you engage with the shared experience of losing a pet, but why do you get more engagement from this than the final meaning of the book? I think the reason why the relatability probably doesn't change that much is because the premise of it being relatable is the process you go through. What this looks like is that you find specific instances that are more compelling than the overarching theme. Why is this? Because one, it's more proximate and it's more understandable. When you're reading the book, you don't immediately know what the final issue is. More so, you focus on what's happening. That's why this is more relatable to you. What this looks like is that maybe the book is about the meaning of life, but someone lost their car during the book. You relate to that. But second of all, it's more accessible. That is to say, when you read something, you don't immediately analyze every single deeper message that is within the novel. What it looks like is you probably are able to accept what's happening overall. You still engage with that. But third of all, a lot of people just don't read that deep into reading. They don't understand the deep messages. But all of this shows why relatability doesn't actually change that much. But note that the author's intent can still be separate. They can still enjoy that. But second of all, even if it gets relatable, why is this actually a really bad thing? I think fundamentally, it means that you're consuming a version of the book that you have warped to fit with your own perceptions. What this means is that this is the point at which you lose the meaning behind the author's work, which is fundamentally a very harmful thing. It's even worse when someone relates but gets the wrong meaning, because you lose the integrity behind the author's intent. For example, you have a lot of books in New Zealand that focus on the Māori protesting and camping on land before it being seized. They went through things about being pepper sprayed, all of this. The intention of these books are probably to show the injustices faced, to show the historical events. But when people take their own perception on this, they might relate it to something like hard work, like perseverance. This is a good idea, it's a good message, but it detracts from the core idea. The reason why this is very likely to happen is because of environmental influences. What this looks like is if you were born into a household that is probably racist, when you were born you probably weren't exposed to these ideas. When you read these books and you're taught to talk about your own intention, you believe these things. This is really harmful because you don't understand the nuances about this book. Before I move on, I'll take your point.
Does the speaker not recognise that these people who are bringing their own experience to the table would never have related to the book originally, so it can only be a gain?
I don't think that they can never relate to the book originally. I think they can still relate through things like seeing the hard work, the perseverance that people who are protesting face. But the reason why this is so bad is because when they think they've related, they no longer have the open mindset to appreciate the true meaning of the author's intent. You lose all of that awesome nuanced description, the detail, the historical events that the author tries to bring to you. But then there's moves on to about why authors don't actually want to write anymore. Note that this is extinction. I think the context of this is that authors write for like a love of literature. They want to put their ideas, they want to put their meaning out there. When people are taking what they've written and made a whole different idea of that, especially for books about marginalized communities, maybe like about LGBT, like with Heartstopper, when it becomes a really widespread thing and you have a focus on death of the author, people take their own interpretation. Maybe what was supposed to begin as a really good, really enlightening series just became a widespread thing that is misinterpreted, that is like the focus has shifted to something that is a lot more harmful. But then they tell you that authors like it when you connect with them. This is really bad again because you have a lot of oversaturation in the book market already. What this looks like is you have, because of this focus of death of the author, you have a focus on readers' intent. This means that authors essentially have to find a way to appeal to this. There's been a lot of loss of quality in the current status quo in the book industry because people are so pressed on making sure that other people enjoy what they're writing.
You know what?
That's really bad. Before I move on, I'll take your point.
Haven't authors always had to appeal to readers to, sell books?
Yes, of course they have to appeal to readers, but also there's this very, very crucial and very important aspect of them needing to maintain the integrity of their work, not feeling pressured to lose all the awesome nuanced details that they want to bring because there's such a focus on people not believing in what they have to say and people taking their own stances. But moving on then about how authors are going to obscure the meanings behind their work. I think that one, they often have to because like I mentioned, there are books with clear intent and books that don't. What this looks like is you have that poem about trees, which is supposed to be a mask thing with the deeper meaning of acting against climate, but because it was written in a period where people didn't care, they had to mask it behind something else. This means that authors often can't explicitly say what exactly they want to. They have to do it through these unclear things. You can only access this when you have a focus on the author's intent, not when you have death of the author. But also, I think that oftentimes the intent just might not be as clear as they want to claim because of many reasons. Maybe it's the author didn't want to make it that obvious, but maybe it's just hard to find out what is going on. But then they tell us that critiquing is a lot harder when there's an objective truth. I think the first thing that you need to realize is that to analyze something, to understand the deeper meaning, you have to know the author's intent first. You need to understand the fundamental rules behind what they're trying to tell you. What this looks like is if I want to construct my own house, I have to know how to actually build a house before I go on to add some walls to it, right? If I don't even know how to build a house from the ground up, my house is going to collapse. That's the same analogy you should bring into the interpretation. When you don't know the fundamental meaning behind the literature, you essentially can't add your own nuance or some analysis onto it because you don't even know what it's trying to say in the first place. That's why critique actually gets a lot worse on app. That's why you have to stand with Nick in this debate. So proud to negate.
I thank the second speaker from the negating team for their speech, and I invite the third speaker of the affirmative team to stand and close their speech.
Ned loses this debate when they fundamentally misunderstands the reasons behind authors choosing to write and the ways in which authors are able to engage their readers, the ways in which their readers are able to engage in literature. This is how we win. Okay, a few things to get through today. Firstly, some clarification on why authors write, and then going through this idea of how are individually on each side going to get an author's message across, and on which side are we going to get more engagement from the readers and better interpretations overall. Okay, so we get this big push from the negating team that, like, authors' right to express themselves, authors' right to get a very specific message across, and on our side of the house, we are somehow creating a detriment to this. Okay, we broadly agree with the reasons that they've given us why authors write. We think that, as with any artist, when an author has, like, something that is really weighing them down, when they have some message that they feel can only be portrayed through a literary aspect, that is how they're going to do it. That is how they've always done it. But necessarily an author has always had to appeal to a reader when they write. They've always had to think about the way that it's going to be interpreted by others and the way that they are able to convey that message most effectively when they write. This looks like people like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, who are very Christian authors, who can still appeal to, like, a humongous range, literally all over the world, of people who don't necessarily agree with their Christian values, but they're able to alter their text in a way that reaches a large audience. We think that when we limit ourselves on the negating side of the house to a singular interpretation of C.S. Lewis's works as, like, fundamentally Christian, we lose all of the value of that writing. We lose all of the engagement that we get from readers worldwide.
You know why?
That is why the points they make cannot stand. Before I move on, I'll take a point.
Why is it that because people are now understanding author's intent, they can't have any self-perception whatsoever?
I don't understand what you mean. I think I know what you're saying. Because, like, they've tried to make this push on their side of the house that they can have just as much understanding, individual understanding and interpretation on their side of the house as they get on our side of the house. But this is just fundamentally untrue. When we limit ourselves to one understanding, limit ourselves to the way that an author, like, deliberately wrote their work, it means that people are, like, incapable of making their own observations about these works. They feel that they, like, are being pushed down or unable to, like, come up with their own interpretations because it is simply portrayed as wrong. And when we have this, it means that we get less engagement, and I'll get into that a bit later. But firstly, like, moving on to what they've said, I think that authors understand the importance of being understood. I know that sounds a bit cyclical, but when we put, like, our words out there, when they understand that, like, sometimes this is the only way that you can communicate with people, we think that fundamentally authors are going to understand that people will have different interpretations of their works. This is not a bad thing. Authors want there to be different interpretations because they understand the need for people to have art, to have literature, to be able to connect and to feel understood by others. Even if that wasn't the author's intention in writing, we think that it's just as powerful for an author to know that they made an impact on, like, a young person's life when reading their book, even if their book was about, like, the struggle of being old. Okay. I want to use an example in The Hate You Give, right? Because this is a really tangible story that I think relates to all of their content on marginalized communities, where it was definitely written to, like, talk about the struggles of African American teenagers specifically in America. Firstly, like, a few things on this. I think firstly, it's not hard for me as a white girl to understand the message behind that story. I think broadly this is true for everyone. People can understand that messaging. I think what makes the story so impactful is the fact that, like, that people are broadly able to relate to it when it talks about these themes of, like, bullying, when it talks about these themes of, like, being harassed, when someone who is white is able to say, like, hey, I've been in that situation, I've seen myself in their shoes, then they are able to connect those dots independently and say that they can understand, like, broadly the struggle that is being portrayed through that novel. We think it is so much more impactful when people make these observations and these connections independently, instead of just reading the author's biopic and, like, saying, oh, I guess they were trying to make a comment on how black people in America are treated. We think it's much more powerful on our side of the house. Okay, when they say that, like, we ignore context and the beliefs of people after death, we think that, like, actually this isn't even a bad thing. And this goes right back to what we told you at James, where the world changes and literature and its interpretation must necessarily change with it. So this means that, like, if an author way back when was trying to make a commentary, for example, George Orwell with 1984, that was very specific to his time period, that doesn't mean that we can't change those interpretations to apply them to the modern world. We don't think then that this is a bad thing. We think this also goes back to like the idea that when more people have interpretations on these works, we are able to create more discussion. This means that even when we have these potentially harmful narratives coming through of like, oh, this applies to like a right-wing agenda, for example, we then have more people who are able to come through and counter it with even more ideas and even more interpretations, and we think this is a good thing. This is what is creating like actual critical thinking, as opposed to just going to that person and saying, no, the author was liberal, therefore you're wrong, because we don't think that a right-wing activist is going to buy that. We think what a right-wing activist is going to buy is like a bunch of different people coming to them and saying, no, hey, I think you've actually really misinterpreted the work. Here are my X, Y, Z reasons why, and we think that is so much more convincing. And we think at the end of the day that writers write to be understood and heard, but that necessarily means that they understand the plight of people who also want to be understood through their work. Okay, so like, when we think about their content that they've given us on literary criticisms and the fact that like, authors feel this need to maintain integrity throughout their work and they think that it's going to be watered down. Okay. So, on literary criticism, on who gets better interpretation, they've come right out and told us that literature is really hard and people need, like, grounding in, and the only possible way that we're going to get that is through, like, studying the author's background. I think that broadly we can accept that when you read something like, oh my gosh, I've forgotten it. Oh yes, Of Mice and Men. It doesn't help you much to know that the author lived in 20th century America and worked on a ranch. I think that's pretty implicit in the book. What helps you like understand the book is being able to relate to the plight of characters, understanding that they represent different archetypes in time, and being able to relate those archetypes to the people that you see in the modern world. And we think that people are able to draw those connections pretty easily themselves because it reflects their life. Okay, when they say that authors have to, this directly relates to what they say about like authors needing to water their work down. We don't think this is necessary because we think that people like are implicitly able to make these connections. Even if they must water it down, we think that this means it reaches a wider audience, which means that the author is able to like get their views out to more people. And so this is like not even like a harm. Okay, so what have I told you today? I've told you that like everything that they've said about how the authors aren't going to be able to get their messages out is simply untrue. I've told you that we get more engagement from readers and we actually get more impactful understanding of literature because readers draw these conclusions themselves. That is why the negating team's case cannot stand.
I thank the third speaker for his speech, and I invite the third negating team to stand and deliver their speech.
The most important thing in this debate was never the extent to which the reader engages to and connects with work, but it was the minority artists, it was the literature written by people who want to share their experience, share their oppression, and can do that more directly on our side. That is the point at which we win this debate in terms of getting better discourse, getting better awareness for minority art. I think two things I'm going to do in my speech. Firstly, on minority art, and secondly, on the reader in terms of engagement and critique. So then, firstly, on minority art,
what did we tell you? We told you that you are able to make minority art clearer on our side when you're able to directly tell these people like what is the key theme, and you're no longer able to ignore this kind of thing. Whereas on their side, when you are adapting to make connections to your experiences, you are likely to make misinterpretations. You're likely to manipulate the work in a sense. What did they tell you in response to this? They told you two things. Firstly, just that if you're going to spread the message, you probably want to make it clear. Why is this not true? Firstly, we think that a lot of readers don't have authors don't have the capacity to consider how people are going to react to the extent that they think you do. In the fact that these authors just want to share their experiences, they want to share their impression. They don't want to do all of this work considering it. I think that not all authors have this ability to consider it. But secondly, even if it is clear in their work, you can just ignore it. I think that as we told you in Cirrus, you can focus on elements in a 400-page book that are more comfortable to you. Whereas when you are specifically told in your education schools and curriculum that this is a key message of the text, you are much less able to ignore it. I think that then means that you are directly confronted with the message. You cannot ignore it in the same sense if you are uncomfortable with it. But also, thirdly, as we told you, at Sarissa as well, in what was broadly unresponded to, if you need to obscure this message, for instance, if you are not able to specifically tell it for fear of people not wanting to read it, if they disagree, for instance, not wanting to write about climate change because people just might not agree, might not want to read about that. Whereas on our side then, when you are able to have this as they specifically want to know in this interview why you wrote it, you are able to tell them this kind of thing, that went unresponded to. I think it is now too late in the debate for them to respond to that. I think that then means that it is not sufficient for them to say that these readers who want to share their impression, who want people to understand and be aware of these things, are actually able to just make it clear in their things. I think it's when people have the capacity to ignore that and the desire to do so, I think that they are going to ignore minority art, they're going to misportray it. I think that even if the author makes it as clear as they can, super duper clear, I think it's still when the incentive and the capacity exists for people to go and ignore these interpretations, that is probably the point at which you get less engagement with minority art, whereas on the comparative on our side, you're directly telling people what these themes are, what the author really cares about. Secondly, they told us then that it's still skewed when you can skew the author's words. I think this is just not true for a couple of reasons. Insofar as the author can actively resist if you're doing something that's very against their work, but also just insofar as this is something you're being taught directly in schools. It's much harder to skew this if you're showing an interview of the author. You can't just skew their words in that way. I think then at the end of this point, it is relatively clear that the authors just don't have the capacity to make it clear. And even if they do have the capacity to make their thoughts clear, it is very easy for people to ignore and specifically select messages. Whereas on our side, they are specifically confronted in schools, in the education system, with these messages that they cannot then ignore, that they have to then engage with and consider. What that then means then is that the outcomes we told you at Bruce still stand. That means that we get more awareness of minority issues, that we get discussion for the people who are uniquely vulnerable, who have no ability to share their stories otherwise. That is the people who are the most helped in this debate, when we get more awareness around these specific issues, when we get to discussion, when we switch the Overton window toward these kind of points of discussion. I think that then is what we win this debate on. But even if we don't win on that, why did we not win on the reader why did they not win on the reader in terms of engagement and critique? But before that, I'll take a point.
Yeah, so if you're told at school that, for example, a C.S. Lewis novel is exclusively about Christianity, how is that going to narrow your ability to interpret it?
I think that when you're told it's about Christianity, then you go and explore Christianity, you go and consider and are more aware of Christianity. I think that that is a very good example of how Christianity is not clear in Narnia. I think that just because Aslan is a lion doesn't mean that everyone who reads Narnia is going to believe the Christianity. I think that is a specific example of where their mechanization of the authors making their messages clear just doesn't apply. I think that then shows that it is not true that the author is just going to make the Christianity clear so that everyone is going to read it. I think that specifically that then means that the people who are in schools, who are doing this literary analysis, are able to directly connect with the authors. I think that is very good in the sense that we get what the authors want to share. That is shared, which is a good subjective benefit for the artist. They try to tell you that the artists want interpretations of their work. I think that in the specific context of the artists who are wanting to share their experiences, wanting to share their impression, I think that what they want much more so is to get people to be aware of these things, to get people to understand their messages. I think it is not true to say that they want people to take some random other message to misinterpret or ignore their work. I think that just isn't true at all. I think that what the artist cares about the most in this sense is people understanding the message that they write the book for the entire reason of. So then, onto the reader then. What did we hear from Affirmative on this? We heard kind of three claims. Firstly, there's this idea that you're going to engage more because you're you can make connections with the book. I think that, specifically why we think this is untrue is the fact that a lot of people just read anyway. That is to say that, the kind of person who engages with literature outside of schools is just the kind of person who wants to read for enjoyment. It's the kind of person who's unlikely to engage with literature on each side. Meaning that there's unlikely to be a specific difference. Meaning that the kind of difference that we get is the kind of difference in terms of literary discussions. It's the kind of difference in terms of English classes, in terms of curriculums, as we told you in our model. I think that then means that it's unlikely to get a significant difference in terms of interpretations. The average viewer is not going to be watching interviewers, but that then means that engagement is broadly symmetrical. But also then the stuff we told you at Bruce about how it is unclear, it's very hard to engage with literature in the sense that you have no starting point for the messages, and it's very hard to just make interpretations. The only response we heard to that was at third, in terms of this example of men and mice, and not being important that someone lives on a ranch. I think that maybe it's not important that someone lives on a ranch, but maybe it is important that this is a key theme of the text, whatever the key themes of the text are. If the key theme of the text is oppression, and you're going into it with this specific minority oppression, or that kind of thing, it helps you contextualize, it helps you have a starting point for your literary analysis. I think that is the point at which it becomes a lot easier to go and look at the types of oppression in the text, at the type of control, at the type of way in which this is done. I think that then means that our claim still stands. But what else did they tell you? They told you that it's much harder to disagree with the author. Insofar as the author is not giving a 400-page seminar on the meaning of their book, I think that there is still a significant amount of room to interpret the meanings of the author, to specifically point out parts within the text and do things like interpretations without specifically contradicting the author. I think that then means that we get within the meanings that the author wants, we get specific analyses, we get you going and looking at the book for symbols, for quotes, for motifs, and things like that. I think that then means that you can specifically disagree with parts within, you can have those specific interpretations, and also just, if you disagree with specific messages within the text, you're probably just, not going to read it anyway, in that sense. But also then, the third claim, just on the fact that, it's off, time period is off. I think that, insofar as they want to talk about George Orwell and, being relevant, I think insofar as, George Orwell, maybe his main interest in the text was, talking about oppressive, dictatorships, I think that insofar as we had interviews, it probably just stays relevant on our side. It's unclear why that's mutually exclusive, but also even in the sense that we think it is mutually exclusive, that's probably bad. We gave you an example of Walt Whitman, whose, liberal, works were, misinterpreted by the far right. They told you that the far right just is going to believe a bunch of analysis literarily. I just don't think that the far right has incentives to believe that kind of thing. I think that uniquely when you have specific authors as being placed as important, that is the kind of person who can literally look at an interview of the author, literally look at a foreword of the author, and then you just can't say that kind of thing because you can present them with direct evidence that they are wrong. When we have more forewords on our side, that is the kind of truth. I think that then means that they don't get significant amounts more engagement. That then means that you should weigh this debate in terms of the vulnerable minority communities, the particular kinds of people who are unable to share their experiences on their side of the house, who are unable to make it as clear as they would like you to believe. That is why we win this debate on minority art. Thank you.
I thank the third speaker from the Getting team for their speech, and as is traditional, I will now reverse the speaking order and I invite the negation of my speaker to stand and deliver their speech.
Authors were not the infallible deities that side proposition wanted to claim they were. They have their own flaws in the way they want to depict their works, and they have their own agendas that they want to promote in their text. Insofar as they're not coming across in their side, that's when voices get left unheard and people suffer as a result. I'm going to talk about two things in the speech. First on writers, then on readers. Firstly, on writers. Proposition came out to say that writers love literature and are wanting to express themselves. Their material here was twofold. First, that authors love different interpretations, and second, that if authors cared about the messages, they would make it clear in the first place. We told you three things about how authors want to share their experiences and they get harms on their side as a result. Firstly, on overgeneralization and people not understanding the implicit meaning of the text that's actually being said. And notice the example we got from Third Pop and the kind of language they used, which was able to prove an argument. When they were talking about the story that promoted things or that talked about racial discrimination, the language about the themes being like bullying and harassment. Notice in their world, it stops there. It's just about bullying and harassment because a majority of people have never lived through racial discrimination. Comparatively, on outside, we get to hear about these authors, the lives they lived through, and what they wanted to talk about, that's when we know what the text was actually about, the stories that actually matter in this world. Secondly, the material from second was never responded to from their side. Sometimes authors just need to obscure the stories to tell their books. For instance, nobody cared about climate change in the mid-2000s, so the kinds of stories and poems written in that time had to obscure the meaning behind metaphors and themes that were very that are harder to interpret in the first place. What we get on our side is we get studies of these authors' intentions, what they cared about. We're able to uncover the actual meanings behind these texts and expose them to the world. Alternatively, those stories stay as just stories about trees. It becomes not very serious on their side, the meaning gets lost. The last thing we told you is we allow authors to critique and correct themselves and shield themselves from bad interpretations. Because maybe it's true that if authors are able to or maybe it's true that if authors get misinterpreted, they're probably drowned out by the media, but at least their voice is there critiquing it. Alternatively, when they say something, they're far more likely to be drowned out because the media just doesn't care. At the end of this then, you believe that the authors lose out on their ability to share their messages, which is particularly pernicious towards vulnerable and marginalized groups in society when they would otherwise be unheard. But also, just in the instances where authors love having other interpretations, their books just aren't that deep, right? For instance, when C.S. Lewis was writing A Lion, a Witch, and the Wardrobe, Christianity was intentionally obscured. It's just not that serious in the debate. If they want to claim that that was a big harm, it's just not that true. At the very least, readers can see how Christianity might play into it on their side to inform the kinds of readings that they're able to get. Alternatively, they just never get that in the first place. Their types of readings are far less nuanced. Lastly, on readers, I'm just going to start out here by saying that I don't think the readers was the biggest thing in this debate. I just think there's other instances when the author and the way that they want to share their work mattered far more. But we still win on readers. This was SidePop's biggest push, to say that readers just enjoy books far more. What did we tell you in response? Firstly, there are so many other ways to enjoy books, just like reading the plot, just like I love this character. It's these are very easy ways in which people can enjoy and interact with books. But secondly, other interpretations and that way their material wanted to play on being able to engage with the book uniquely was still able to happen. You can just respond to the text in an individual way. For instance, you can just disagree with the author's meaning. It's not that hard to say, the author meant this by the book, I just disagree with it. This kind of interaction can still happen. Material from first that was never responded to. Lastly, we flip the outcomes because we do help the average person build literary understanding. This is where we explain that literature is hard. It's not that easy to go in and ascribe the meanings of text when it's already wrapped up in flowery language. Then what we get on our side is we give a helping hand. We give a starting point for people to build their own independent thoughts. We make people far better readers. Applause.
I thank the negating reply speaker for their speech, and I invite the final reply speaker to stand and deliver the final speech.
I think when we look at this debate as a whole, before we get into path to victories and how either side wins this debate, it's important to clear up a major clarification. We've got a massive push late in the neg team's case that art, in fact, is not dying, contrary to what we had been doing this debate on over the first idea. We've got no technology, media, social, TikTok. Actually, it's all improving this. In fact, when we, I think, sense checking this, we believe that, again, from the stuff I told you at first, that's not true. Art is in fact dying because literature is in fact dying because it is in constant competition with things like movies, with things like social media as well, in which, when you think about it, when most people have the option to watch a movie or to watch a book of the very same story, most people will go and watch the movie. read. That is why we prove. That's why it's very important to view this debate, through the lens and through the context that art is dying. And the main priority in this debate is to preserve art as we know. And I'll give you reasons that even if you don't believe that, even if you believe their case, we actually still win this debate. So 2 points of class in this debate. Which side gives us better engagement, and then which side gives us like better interpretations, whatever that means. Okay, so first one, which side gives us better engagement? And again, viewing it through the lens and the context that art is dying, we believe this is the most important, not art, literature is dying in this debate. We believe that this is the most important because of this, because we get more engagement, we get more readers, we get more authors inside literature doing more things. We are therefore like being able to save art, to reverse that cycle, and to make it far more worthwhile. That literature, if I say art, doesn't mean you know I mean literature. Literature is so okay. What do we get from this? So we give you this precept first. For me, is that we get more accessible, with more perspectives, more times, and disagreements. We basically get like some mitigatory response from Neg that first of all, people can just read it for enjoyment, and we don't believe this is true because again, as I told you at first, why do people read? They read for connection, right? And we get this stuff like, they're going to read for tropes, they're going to read for like character ideas. If we're talking about like readers who read we're talking about people who read quite a lot. They've seen all the tropes before. They want connection with a book. They want to be taught something. They want to learn something about themselves or something nuanced. They want to get that. We don't believe they can get that when you just have one interpretation all the time. They don't have this. They have a societal pressure underside Neg to keep on continuing with this one interpretation. Art, literature becomes stale under their side of the house. So why is this important in this debate? How do we win off this? If you believe art is dying, then it means it's far more vital on our side of the house. And this is just like how we win this debate, how we prove that art gets better. But even if you don't, we still believe like you're going to get far more discussion under our side of the house, and you're going to get far more people talking about these interpretations, which we still believe is a real like a net benefit for us. And it also means like more people engaged in art means more authors, means more people that can like be sustainable and even can like get be sustainable and like engage in the arts. So that's one way in which we win this debate. And which side gives us better interpretations is another way we can look at this. So we get this massive push from Neg about how this is going to affect minority art and how this is going to affect authors and like their integrity and the integrity of their books. So first on this point about minority art. First of all, we generally believe that minority art literature is far less impactful because there's far less people viewing it. If people aren't able to bring their own interpretation, if something is like sectioned off, so only a group of people who already have these shared experiences can relate to it, can engage with it, we don't believe you're going to get like the desired outcome of getting a whole lot of people learning about this experience, learning about these ideas. And like for example, there's no reason for a white middle class guy, a boy, a teenager, to like read a piece of art about racism in the United States, for example. We believe that's a net benefit when they're not doing that, because that takes away some of like the nuance and some of the power that minority art gives us to share these experiences with people that don't experience it. So we believe that's a net negative that Neg have, that really, in reality, minority art is diluted and doesn't have the same amount of impact. And that is one of the ways in which also a bunch of stuff about messaging here as well, which we've told you around this debate, but ultimately we believe like we get far more of these interpretations spread out, saving art, helping and helping these interpretations grow and expand. And that is why I'm proud to affirm.
Yep. I think both sides thought it was an excellent debate. I invite them to cross the floor and greet each other however they like.